Now, before getting into that, you need to obviously pass the initial hurdle, that is going through the admissions eligibility criteria. As I said, because this is not a coursework degree, uh, the eligibility criteria for admission is quite different. Ideally, in Australia, New Zealand, and in many cases UK as well, they would require you to hold a research master's program. That would mean either a master's by research, MRes, or an MPhil. Or in many cases, and most of the times nowadays, it's fine to go through with that with a coursework master's degree, but it must have a significant research component, which is usually a thesis. Ideally, this research component should account for at least 25% of the total credit point of that degree. So for example, if you're doing a master's coursework, but it has, let's say, 180 credits, you are doing a thesis, like that post program has a thesis that has, let's say, 60 credits out of 180. So it has to be, as I said, 25% or above. So when you consider the fact that, okay, you have this program where it's 60 credits out of 180 total credits, that's 33.3%. That would mean that, okay, your master's is sufficient to go through with the initial admission criteria because the research component, that thesis, is more than 25% of the credits. So this is a very initial requirement. There are possibilities where exceptions can be made for significant publication history, which is something I actually had received because my master's back in 2012, back at that time, this research component thesis part wasn't that big of a deal. So when I passed my master's, it was with good results, and I did have a thesis, but the credit points were not aligned in that way. So when I was starting to apply in Australian universities, a lot of universities, particularly the smaller ones, they were not making me eligible because it's not meeting that criteria. But then again, exceptions were made, as it can be, depending on significant publication history, which I had prior to my admission with PhD, PhD admission process. So that's the rare cases, but these days now it's quite like standard. Since 2015, pretty much all the coursework master's program in UK and typically have research component exceeding 25%. Same pretty much with a lot of universities in Malaysia and a lot of other countries. However, in Australia, for example, when you do a coursework master's, most of the time they don't have any thesis. So that would mean you would not be eligible for that. So if you are someone who is playing this long game of PhD admission by planning to go for a master's overseas, ensure that you're doing a coursework master's with the research component meeting this criteria. A lot of universities don't in Australia. Most of the master's courses, they don't have a thesis, which means it's not fulfilling this criteria. So if you do that, you will not be eligible to apply for PhD straight away. Maybe they will let you need to do another master's in research, which in most cases might not be feasible given the amount of tuition fees you have to pay. So this is a very important fact to look out for. And obviously, at the end of the day, PhD is something that is pursued by students who are academically talented. And one of the basic criteria for the selection panel to overview is to look at the CGPA. So essentially, even if you have an undergraduate degree from whichever university you are doing, ensure that the CGPA is at the top 5%. That's essentially a very good cutoff point. In terms of publication, given the fact that it's so competitive, most of the universities, particularly the smaller ones where there is a lack of funding, you will see that STEM science sector, they have more scholarships available compared to business. In many cases, they might have 2 or 3 scholarships for business students compared to 20 or 30 for science in many cases. So to cut through that competition, one fact that makes up for a good sort of eligibility criteria fulfillment is having a good publication record, because that carries a lot of points in the whole admission process. Typically, a good publication record of at least 2 or 3 Scopus or ABDC index article is a good way to proceed, which again begs the question that this is a long game. You need to plan ahead, and there is a long process to go with. You also need to convince prospective supervisors who has agreed to supervise you based on a solid research proposal. Even though some universities, they don't allow or they don't require an applicant to contact a supervisor straight away. Rather, once the criteria is met, they will assign supervisors. for universities like, in many cases, Monash or UNSW. But most of the universities would require a supervisor to be agreed to supervise, to proceed. And as I will discuss soon on how to convince supervisors, a solid research proposal is required. Many consider teaching experience to be a mandatory fact. It's not. It's good if you have it, particularly when you start with your PhD, and if usually at the second year level, PhD students are provided with teaching opportunities or teaching assistant opportunities in most universities. But it's not a mandatory thing. It's mostly the three above criteria that's more important.